I'm now porn adjacent. I run a tabletop game stream regularly with some porn stars, which you can check out with suitable precautions in place at tabletopless.org. And just know that I put as much effort into this campaign as I would any other tits or no tits. Hello lovelies. Continuing my trend of doing reviews this week, I am reviewing Hoard of the Dragon Queen for Dungeons & Dragons. Now, this is an interesting retrospective, I think, because this was the first adventure, really, that came out for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And so, looking at this, it's kind of a time capsule of when it came out, how they were expecting people to play, and the sort of production and so on that they were going for in the future. Now, I wouldn't normally review an adventure unless it was particularly outstanding, because it's spoilers and you can't help but be spoilery, but this is old enough, and I suspect that anyone that was going to play it has already played it, that I feel that I can, and I'm probably not going to give too much away anyway. Now, I've talked about this before, but there are general problems with adventures when you're a game designer, when you're a publisher, and you're wanting to put these things out. On the one hand, you want to show people how to play the game, how you intend the game to be played, how you expect them to play it. You want to demonstrate and include all the nice snazzy new mechanics that you've got. That you want to have an example, essentially a playable example of play. Including adventures in the main rulebook can do that, but it drives up the page count and the price, and it's not material that can really be reused over and over again. And the problem with adventures is that they don't sell very well at all. In most groups, you'll tend to find that one person buys all the books, and that's generally the dungeon master. So for every 6 people playing, you maybe sell one book. And the only books that you're really guaranteed of selling are the core books. And that was the philosophy back with 4th edition. Wizards has a much lower output rate than it used to have with 5th edition, which has hopefully allowed them to up the quality. But you can see that they're trying to present a lot of this material as more core material. Hardback, full colour, all of that. But you can really sense the kind of hangover from 4th edition through this book. It's really a string of combat encounters with very little roleplay, extremely railroady, I guess, as a beginner's adventure, as a new adventure. That kind of makes sense. But it does, in particular, limit the amount of stuff that can be reused in your own games. When I produce adventures, which I do, I try to make them into something that's reusable. And there isn't a huge amount of reusable content in this. There aren't enough expansions on rules, new monsters, new magic items or whatever, to make it a worthy buy in its own right, with or without the adventure. So like I say, adventures don't sell well, which is why a lot of games companies don't particularly produce them. Core books do. Wizards seems to be trying to compensate for that in a number of ways, but not really by adding a lot of reusable material. We start out with a siege at a small town called Green Nest, and a siege of a little keep in this village. The village doesn't make a lot of sense in its layout and population and so forth, whether from a medieval fantasy point of view or certainly not from a Dungeons and Dragons point of view. What I aim for when I write is what I call plausibility, and there's just kind of lacks it. And it starts immediately with this siege, with your brand shiny new characters, and throws a dragon at you right away. Now, that worked in Skyrim, and they seem to be attempting to produce the same sort of a effect in this, to impress upon you the power and danger that dragons involved, but it also feels like they kind of shot their bolt right from the start with this. If the dragon did land a hit on the characters, they would be instantly dead. So it kind of makes you work around it, rather than using maybe a lower level dragon that would be a deadly level encounter all by itself for first level characters, which is the way I probably would have done it if this were me writing it. As it is, the dragon just feels like a Deus Ex Machina and doesn't really need to be there at all. It shoots its bolt far too early. From the siege and the various combat missions involved there, you counter-raid the camp of the raiders who are laying siege to the town. More combat encounters. You raid a dragon hatchery. More combat encounters. Then we get a little break with some overland travel and some random encounters, which will most certainly include combat. We get a couple of passages on Baldur's Gate and some sort of paragraph-long NPCs in there. That's something, I suppose. Then we move on to Waterdeep. There's less information about that really than Baldur's Gate, but I guess they were anticipating the other material that they would have in the future. From there, you proceed to a castle, which is more of an old school dungeon crawl, except it doesn't really have the feel of an old school dungeon crawl because you just don't have to be as careful in 5th edition. From there, we finally start to encounter the kind of out there wacky magic that you see in new versions of D&D. Not even the tongue-in-cheek, though, that you used to have in old school. So you follow the magic, confront yet more people, more fighting at a lodge, maybe a little bit of roleplay there, and then proceed to the final confrontation in a Storm Giant's castle, which is a more fantastical version of the earlier castle dungeon. Hopefully none of that's given anything away. It's very railroady. It's one encounter to the next, to the next, to the next. It's almost entirely combat, and enough combat to take you from, I think it's level 1 to level 8 with a normal sized group. That's a lot of fighting. That's a lot of dead monsters. And it's not particularly satisfying from a roleplay point of view, despite the fact that 5th edition made some inroads into bringing more narrativist mechanics, roleplay-oriented mechanics, into Dungeons & Dragons with 5th edition. I mean, it's okay as a very basic starting adventure, but there's really not a great deal to recommend it. One of the dungeons, at least, is expandable, should you wish to delve deeper into the caves and darkness beneath. So that's something that goes back to very old RPGs. I believe the basic set dungeon, which started out with a carrion crawler, which was a bit dangerous for first level characters, I think that had a section you could expand on. Early Dragon Warriors Adventures, I think, had a section you could expand on. Certainly the early Fighting Fantasy role-playing game, you could add on to the dungeon as and when you wanted. It does make more sense, the dungeons, and they are slightly more plausible than a lot of old school sort of grab bag Monty Hall dungeons, but not by a lot. And the plan of the cult that is the main antagonist doesn't make a lot of sense, but you can kind of hand wave and say, oh, religion, as a reason for why they act so irrationally and do such stupid things. But to my jaded eye from 30 plus years of role-playing games, it just it doesn't hit the mark for me. But I am cynical and old and extremely experienced, so it may not hit you in the same way. Style. I mean, the quality is good. You expect more of a top-tier publisher like Wizards. Maybe that's a little bit unfair, but it's not quite up to the standard of the more modern books. The pages have a matte finish rather than a gloss finish, and that, combined with whatever colour printing process they've used here, makes a lot of the artwork look extremely flat and extremely muddy. Many, but not all, of the character illustrations have weird proportions. I know this seems like it's nitpicking, but this is a high-level publisher. You kind of expect things to be a bit better. The modern stuff is better than what's here, but considering everything, yeah, it's just a bit disappointing. The hardback is unnecessary for what is about 100 pages. For numerous reasons, I think that softbacks are more economical to ship. They use less material, less of a carbon footprint, you know. And for something like this, which is basically a one-off, you don't really need to be full colour. And as a beginning adventure, as something that people were going to buy along with the main rulebooks at the beginning, I think it would have made a lot more sense. I think it still makes a lot more sense to publish adventures without regard for longevity. So bring the price down by making it black and white, making it soft cover, all of those things. That just makes more sense to me, while the hardback and the higher quality printing makes sense for the core books, at least. So it's just not there, really. I mean, most Wizards of the Coast books would automatically get a score of 4 for style, just due to the quality of the art and the layout and the way it's put together and so on. For this, however, I would only give it a 3. In terms of substance, you have the adventure, which will last a few sessions, but that's one shot, and then the book's no good to you anymore, and you can just toss it. So I always look for longevity, things that you can reuse or take inspiration from, or new mechanics and so on that are brought in with adventures. Maybe that's a bit unfair of me, but it's what I try to do with my own material, and so that sets my expectations for others. There's a few magic items that you might want to use, a couple of monsters, some NPCs. It amounts to about 15 pages out of almost 100 pages. And even then, the material there either isn't enough when we're talking about Baldur's Gate or Waterdeep. The maps are certainly reusable, that's something good. Yeah, that 15 out of 100 is generous, very generous. So in terms of substance, I'm afraid I can only give it a 2. Plus, there's just not a lot of weight to the adventure. It's just this string of combat encounters. You don't really get a sense of the importance of what the characters are doing. So 3 out of 5 for style, 2 out of 5 for substance. That's an overall 5 out of 10, or 2.5 out of 5. Deeply, deeply average, and from a big publisher, you expect more. Zang.
The Atomic Age, with its A-bombs, transistorized radios, jet engines, and a new breed of dangerous supervillain, requires heroes to face the challenge. That's where you come in. The world needs you, Agent. Agent of Swing.